Hey people, it's episode 50. So I woke up this morning and someone had stolen an hour of my life. It's that day. It's that day when daylight savings time happens. So we spring forward and we lose an hour of sleep, we lose an hour of drinking, we lose an hour of fucking around. Nothing much we can do about it, but sucks a bit. It's also a National Write Down Your Story Day. And I've been thinking about this lately. I've been blessed with amazing friends who just have so many incredible stories. And you guys, write down your story. Why not? It's Albert Einstein's birthday. Okay, so first off, I gotta say, I am no Einstein. I want to apologize for being such a dunce last week and screwing up the posting of the video. Posting only 2 minutes instead of 20. What a dummy. Anyway, crap happens. And I do have to say that I got my shot the other day. So the scientific term for how I feel right now is slightly boogered up. Okay, so anything could happen. Anything could happen. Okay, so hold on to your hats. Like I said, Albert Einstein's birthday today. He is a guy who actually had a deep relationship with music. He always said if he wasn't going to be a physicist, he would have been a musician. He was a great violin player. He was so great that the reason his second wife married him was because of his violin playing. Apparently, he played publicly too. And his violin had a name. It was called Lena. And he took Lena with him wherever he went. And he used music to figure out his physics problems. Whenever he got stuck, he's trying to work out this difficult mathematical physics problem, and he'd just go and he'd pick up Lena, and play some Mozart, or sit down at the piano, and then, often as not, after a while, he would go, aha! So, Albert Einstein, musician and genius. So, happy birthday to you, Albert Einstein. Another thing I'm pretty excited about this week is one of my very, very favorite artists of the last few years, Valerie June, has finally put out a new record. It's called The Moon and the Stars. It's a bit more of a contemplative record, and it's not as much rock and roll-y as some of her other ones, but she's got this killer Memphis horn section going on in there, and I'm super excited about it. You guys should check it out. Valerie June is just amazing. So, this week, I can't believe that we're doing this, but I think it's time that we took a look at the best-selling folk group of all time, the Kingston Trio. Hang on, bye. The Kingston Trio, they are like the Rodney Dangerfield of folk. They just can't seem to get any respect. The hardcore folkies didn't like them at all because they just weren't authentic enough. I kind of get it. They have this squeaky clean image. And, to quote my dear departed good friend, Mr. Chick Parker, he went into a club one time and he came back out and he said, "Steve, there's one too many firm-jawed, clear-eyed men in that room for my liking." I totally get that. As rough and, little ragtaggle rockers that we were, these squeaky clean guys got our backs up, and we were suspicious of them because, those were the guys that would beat you up. However, this is childish prejudice. It is COVID times. We have to open our hearts. We have to give these guys a chance and just see who they are. And, let's do that together, okay? Let me give you a couple numbers to roll around in your head, okay? This is how big they were. In '58, they released an album, their first album. It had this song Tom Dooley on it, and it grossed in excess of $25 million, okay? The sales of their first couple records accounted for 15 or 20% of all of Capitol Records' revenue, okay? They basically kept Capitol Records afloat. They grossed, the band themselves grossed over $1 million a year. And that's like in 1959 dollars. They got $200,000 to do a 7-Up commercial. They bought a line of clothing and they made another $500,000. They sold 25 million records for Capitol Records between 58 and 61. They owned real estate, restaurants, clothing lines. Holy smokes, they were so huge and successful. So who are these dudes? Okay, let's just introduce the characters. Okay, so there's two guys from Hawaii. Dig. Okay, Bob Shane and Dave Guard. Okay, so these guys knew each other in Hawaii and they played together in Hawaii. So Bob Shane was a rhythm guitar player. He was not trained. He didn't know how to read music. He wasn't the best harmonizer, so he was the guy who got to sing the lead. He actually worked as what he said was the world's first Elvis impersonator. He was an Elvis impersonator in 1956. He was billed as the Hawaii Elvis. Actually, he talked to Elvis years later, and Elvis just looked at him and went, "Why on earth would you do that?" Anyway, Dave Guard was kind of the smart guy. He was the leader of the band. He was like hard to get along with, but he was the guy who would push and push and push and organize and, force them to learn other stuff. And, he was the guy who was basically in charge. He was a guitar player, a really good guitar player, really good banjo player. He was the guy who would sing the baritone parts. And, he was a pretty smart guy. He went to Stanford and so on. Okay. So Bob and Dave, they formed bands while they were in Hawaii, and their big influences were calypso. Okay, so that's why the Kingston Trio is called the Kingston Trio. It's from Kingston, Jamaica, and they just loved calypso music. They loved Harry Belafonte. They loved all that stuff, and they did a whole bunch of calypso songs. Okay, the other thing they loved was Hawaiian music. Now, there was this dude that they always reference called Gabby Pahinui, who was one of the guys who basically saved traditional Hawaiian music in like the 40s and 50s. Because there was this kind of Hawaiian music called slack key guitar playing. And oh, my guitar friends, I don't know if I should even tell you about this, because this is like a rabbit hole you could go down and never come out of. But slack key guitar playing is this beautiful, beautiful Hawaiian style of guitar playing. I guess it started off, it was a bunch of Mexicans came to Hawaii in the early 1800s. They left their guitars with the locals. The locals took the guitars and said, I don't like the way it's tuned. So they tuned everything down. But like every group tuned it down in different ways. So a family would have its own special tuning. Like everybody had a different tuning. And they played this beautiful, beautiful rhythmic, melodic fingerstyle guitar, which is just so haunting and wonderful. So Gabby Pahinui was the guy who kind of made the comeback for this style of music, and Dave Guard and Bob Shane totally always acknowledge him as being a huge influence. So my guitar playing friends, if you want to go on the internet and start looking at different slack key tunings, don't say I didn't warn you. Okay. Anyway. Those two guys, they had bands in Hawaii. They had a band called Dave Guard and the Calypsonians. Like I said, they loved calypso. So, but they grew up and they went to California to go to university. So Dave Guard, the smart guy, he went to Stanford, the fancy ass university there, and Bob Shane went to a business school there. And in business school, Bob Shane met this other guy, Nick Reynolds. Okay, so Nick, the third magic member of this band, Nick was a guy who could harmonize with anything. He could sing like a bird. He played a 4-string tenor guitar, but he could also play congos, bongos. He played ukulele. He could play guitar. He was kind of like the glue that held everything else together. He wasn't the leader of the band, but he kind of made it all happen. Now, one thing, Nick, obviously didn't have this Hawaiian influence, but he loved calypso. There's one other thing that they all agreed on, and that was the Weavers. Now, the Weavers were the biggest folk band in the world at that time. Remember, that was Pete Seeger's band, and those guys were getting caught up in that McCarthy witch trial thing that was happening in the 50s because they were all very left-wing, they were communists, basically, or socialists. And, they got in a lot of trouble. They got in a lot of hot water. So all the guys in the Kingston Trio, they loved the calypso, they loved the Hawaiian music, they loved the Weavers. But the thing is, they didn't want to get in the kind of shit that the Weavers were getting into. So they were going to be the squeaky clean Weavers, okay? And that's what they did. This was very premeditated, okay? They figured out we're all going to get we're going to get a uniform, okay? So they went down to Brooks Brothers, and the only kind of shirt they could find that would fit all three of them was these striped shirts. And that became their emblem. And it was so successful that the Beach Boys stole it later on, you know. So they have this, they always wore these same striped shirts, you know, like the Ramones or something. You know, they had a uniform, right? They worked like slaves. Like I said, they would play over 300 dates a year, and they were just trying to hone their craft and figure out what they were doing. So at one point, they're in San Francisco, and there's this club there called the Purple Onion. Okay, and they've got a manager, and he's trying to, you know, straighten them out. He makes them all go take singing lessons, so, you know, they can preserve their voices for this, you know, 300 dates a year that they're playing. Anyway, they were going to do an opening act for, dig this, their good friend Phyllis Diller. Okay, so as it turns out, Phyllis got ill, so they said, okay, Kingston Trio, you guys, you know, you can do the gig, and it turns out that they got the gig, and they did so fantastic because Dave Guard was such a go-getter. He sent out like 500 postcards to every single person he could think of, and they packed the place night after night. And they were so popular that it came to the attention of Capitol Records. And, you know, Capitol Records kind of said, okay, let's check this out. This sounds interesting. So, you know, they had a lot going for them. They were organized, they had the uniform, they had beautiful harmonies, they were really good at what they did, and they weren't any trouble. They weren't like the Weavers, right? So they did folk songs, but, you know, they weren't communists. So they go into Capitol Records, and they get this guy who was basically the guy who did the recording for Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. And he did something very clever. He didn't add strings, which is what everybody did in those days. Like it was just so common to have, you know, good music wrecked because the producer thought, well, we need to add strings to this, you know, we need a little horn section or something. You know, they didn't do that. They just let these three guys play. They mic'd them perfectly. It's still like a marvel of recording how good they were because, you know, it was fairly, you know, not too many mics, not too many tracks. It was just like an amazing capturing of their sound. So they recorded this album. It had Tom Dooley on it, and they start playing around, and, you know, it's kind of selling a bit locally, but it's not really catching on fire. And then these guys in Salt Lake City, these DJs, they start playing it like crazy. And these DJs loved it so much, they phoned all their other DJ friends, and before you know it, it is like wildfire across the entire United States and the world. And all of a sudden, these guys are making those numbers that I talked about earlier, you know, the $25 million. They are just going crazy. So the big song was Tom Dooley. They had lots of other hits. But let's take a second and just dig into Tom Dooley for a second. Just the facts, man. Just the facts. Facts are, this is the most miserable, convoluted ball of yarn I have ever had to deal with. Let me try and introduce the cast of characters so we can explain what the hell is going on here, all right? Tom Dooley, a handsome young man born in North Carolina in 1845. Tom Dooley, as a teenager, falls in love with Ann Foster, the most beautiful girl in town. She knows she's the most beautiful girl in town. She is stuck up higher than a light pole. All right, so they have this little canoodly affair. Ann Foster has a mother, as most of us do. And Ann Foster's mother is unhappy about this little romantic liaison because Tom Dooley is a ne'er-do-well. He has no prospects. He is a laborer, and even worse, he's a musician. Okay?
Oh, no.
So Ann Foster's mother arranges for Ann to be married off to an older man, James Melton, who is a respectable businessman in town. He's a cobbler. Well, so Ann goes off to live with her new husband, James Melton, and you'd think that would be the end of that. You would be wrong. So the Civil War happens, and Tom Dooley and James Melton both have to join the Confederate Army, go off and fight for the cause. They have all sorts of adventures. They get wounded, and it turns out that both of them eventually get captured and sent to a miserable prison camp in the north for Confederate soldiers. This is a terrible place to be. People are dying of starvation and disease, but it turns out Tom and James are made out of sterner stuff, and they survive. And after the war, they make their way back to North Carolina to resume their lives. Funny thing, Tom moves in with James and Anne. And before you know it, those two are canoodling like rabbits, and apparently with James's permission. So that's odd. So you might think that's enough. No, there's more. Anne Foster has a cousin, Laura Foster, who lives in town, about 5 miles away. So Tom Dooley and Laura are also having a little canoodly affair. All right? And Anne is not happy about this at all. So you'd think that would be enough. You'd be wrong. There's more. Anne Foster has one more cousin, Parlene. Parlene is coming into town because she has a horrible disease. And she has to see a doctor. And the only place that has a doctor is this little town. So she moves in with Tom and Anne and James, and she starts working as a domestic. But before you know it, she's doing more than that. It is a frickin' canoodle fest. Everybody is screwing everybody. So Tom is screwing Parlene. Tom is screwing Anne. Tom is going into town and screwing Laura. I don't know what James is doing, but he's probably screwing somebody too. Here's the bad news. The horrible disease that Parlene has is syphilis. Well, you can well imagine what happens next. Yes, everybody's got it. So there is a lot of itching and scratching going on. There is recriminations. There is accusations. The people are unhappy. Tom and Anne, for some reason, think that it's Laura that gave them the clap. So there's all sorts of bad feeling going on here. And one day, Laura just gets up early, steals her dad's best horse, rides off, and is never heard from again. So at first you think, oh, maybe she just ran away because, things are getting pretty hot here in this little tiny town, how people talk, right? But she never shows up again, and pretty soon we start to suspect foul play. All right, so Tom realizes he's going to be in the sights for this, and he pisses off to Tennessee and starts living under an assumed name. Anne Foster gets dragged off to jail and charged with murder, even though they still don't have a body. Parlene breaks down, and she says, Tom and Anne did it. Tom and Anne killed Laura. They're bad people. And they raise a little search party, and they go out into the woods, and they find a shallow grave, and there's Laura, stabbed in the heart with a knife, and a lady's handkerchief over her face. So now we got a body, we got a murder, and Tom has a princely sum of $62 reward on his head. So people are after him, and it's getting hot over there in Tennessee for him. He doesn't know whether to check his ass or scratch his watch, so basically he just hightails it off into the woods. They raise a little posse, they go out there, they find him, they grab him, they drag him back to North Carolina, they put him on trial, and they find him guilty. All right, so he appeals, they have another trial, and they find him guilty again, and they sentence him to hang. So on the eve before he's going to be hung, he writes a little note, and he says, I am the only one who had anything to do with the murder of Laura Foster. Anne had nothing to do with it. Well, this is great for Anne. She's scot-free now. She's been in jail for ages, and she's had this charge on her, hovering over her this whole time. Anne's scot-free. The next day, they put young Tom in a cart. They drive him through town. He's got his own coffin in the cart, so that's convenient, don't you think? They let him get up on the scaffold, and they let him address the crowd, and I guess he rambles on quite a bit, but the essence of it is, he said, I never hurt a hair on that girl's head. So he's trying to take it back. Well, no dice on that one, right? Really, he's lowered in a snake's belly in a wagon rut. So they hang him, and you think, mission accomplished. The poor young girl was murdered, we got the guy, we hung him. But there was always suspicion on Anne. And it turns out that years later, Anne was in a terrible carriage accident, and she badly injured. And the doctor goes in to see her, and apparently she said, I can feel the flames of hell licking at my feet. This seems bad. And everybody's thinking, oh boy, she's going to have a deathbed confession. She's going to admit that she did it. And so the doctor comes out of the room, and they go, well, did she confess? And the doctor says, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. That's patient and physician privilege. I can't tell you anything. But I can tell you one thing. We hung an innocent man. Well, butter my butt and call me biscuit. Doesn't that just dill your pickle? The guys in the Kingston Trio always maintained, we never called ourselves folk musicians. So when the folk purists were getting their knickers all in a knot and saying, you guys are not folk enough for us, the guys in the Kingston Trio were just saying, well, we never said we were, so knock it off. You know, they thought of themselves as a calypso band, a Hawaiian band. Yeah, we do some folk songs too. It's a little self-serving, right? Because obviously they did folk songs. But I also get it. They didn't self-identify as a folk group, so cut them some slack. On the other hand, you know, in the early days when Tom Dooley was taking off and making billions of dollars, there was a guy from Capitol Records showed up at their house and delivered a gigantic bonus check. And he said, congratulations, boys, you're folk artists now. And they all jumped up and said, you bet your ass we are. We'll be anything you want us to be as long as you keep paying us like this. So they were kind of opportunists. You know, they were businessmen. Anyway, a lot of funny things happened. You know, in 1958, it was the first year of the Grammys, and they knew they had to give the Kingston Trio something, but they didn't know what to do. So in 1958, what happened was that the Kingston Trio won the Grammy for the Best Country Artist. Oh, you can imagine the whining and bitching that was coming out of Nashville on that one. On the other hand, Minnie Pearl from the Grand Ole Opry went up to them and said, thank God for you boys, because country music was dying. It was like at a dead end, and you have opened up the door to a whole new audience for us. So you've saved country music. So that's kind of what they did. You know, they were a gateway drug. You know, even though they didn't identify as a folk group necessarily, as a result of their records, millions of people started listening to folk music and were turned on to folk music. So, you know, that's what they did. They had all these different influences, and they just were so successful that they turned people on to all these different influences that they had. You know, even the Hawaiian music. They had some adventures, you know, like just a couple weeks after Buddy Holly died in the plane crash. They were flying in their own private plane because they played so much, you know, 300 dates a year, that they decided to buy some planes because they were rich, right? And they were just, I think they were leaving Memphis, and they ran into a blizzard. And first thing that happens is all the electrics in the plane go out. You can imagine how good a feeling that is. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the fire extinguisher under Dave Guard's seat blows up. So these guys figure, oh, fuck, we're doomed. We're going to die in a plane crash just like Buddy Holly. So, you know, they're teetering and tottering, and their plane is going through the blizzard. The good news is they had a really good pilot. And he flew B-17s in World War II, and he put them down in a farmer's field. And they all teetered out, and some guy came running up, said, are you all right? And one of them says, parlez-vous Italiano? And the guy said, no, you're in Indiana. So, and basically then they all pile in a car, they go to the grocery store, buy a bunch of beer, just pound it back, and then they go and they play their gig at the college. So, you know, they're troopers. Even after this, they went and played their gig. You know, I was originally thinking maybe I would try one of those slack key guitar songs for you, but that would just be disrespectful because I don't know what the hell I'm doing. On the other hand, I'm going to try and check it out. But in the meantime, I'm just going to play a beautiful fingerstyle guitar song that I've been playing for years. I don't even know what it's called. If anybody knows what it's called, you email me and tell me. So that's the story of the Kingston Trio. I am going to say that, you know, this is episode 50. We've gone through a lot of nonsense. We've gone through almost a year. And I think at episode 52, I'm going to take a little vacation. So we're gonna knock it off for a while. And I've got other projects that I want to get done. We got to start working on our second He Mistook Her for a Swan album. I'm going to start putting up some of the stuff that I've recorded over the year. And there's a lot of cool stuff. I may put out a couple of kind of guitar instructional things because I've had a couple of requests on that area as well. So it's not like you're not going to hear from me, but after 52, I think we're gonna take a little break. So you guys hang in there. I think we've passed the worst of it. There's light ahead. All right? Here's a little song for you.